morning and welcome back, everybody, to the Flynn Show for another episode of Philosophy Friday. We're going to discuss Jordan Peterson. And the reason we're going to discuss Jordan Peterson is because he's a very fascinating figure. And I've had enough people request that I do some type of episode, either a Philosophy Friday or Sunday School, just talking about Jordan Peterson. So here we are. And what prompted this is a recent exchange, which I have geared up, which we will listen to and reflect upon. A recent exchange that Dr. Peterson had with Bishop Robert Barron. So that will be the launch pad for our conversation. And I just want to do a little initial stage setting first. I'm not going to be bashing Jordan Peterson in this episode. In fact, I think that he's right about a lot of things in this conversation. And I found myself, I didn't listen to the whole thing, but I listened to a good chunk of it. I found myself agreeing with him more often than I was disagreeing, or the parts where I did disagree. It was more that I thought that his view is incomplete, or he hasn't quite realized that there can be a both and rather than an either or response to a lot of these important metaphysical and religious questions. And I think that, as you'll see as we move through this conversation, I think he is just a little too caught up in that sort of materialistic, scientism-y paradigm. So I welcome your comments. I welcome your thoughts as we move along here. This is, I don't have anything prepared. This is off the cuff. I just didn't have anything else to do for Philosophy Friday. So I'm like, all right, we'll just talk about Jordan Peterson. Already I see some comments coming in. Joel says he's wrong because he treats religious texts as non-literal. We will definitely get to that. There are going to be parts where I part ways with Peterson. Don't get me wrong. I definitely have I have many thoughts on all of that, Joel. So appreciate your comment, and we'll probably get to that. This is a long conversation he had with Bishop Barron, so I don't know how far we'll get. Maybe this will be a multi-part series. But do me a favor, if you're here, like it, comment, subscribe, and give me your thoughts. If you already saw this, let me know what you thought of the exchange in the comments. Let me know what you think of Peterson in general, especially if you're coming from a philosophical or religious topic here. Against fascists, good to see you as always, my brother. Cheers, checking in. Be curious to hear what you thought of this conversation as well. So very good. Okay, before I start playing clips, and that's how this is going to work. I'll play a clip and I'll pause it and I'll comment. Again, I don't have anything planned, so I have no idea how this conversation is going to go. This is all impromptu. But I figured there's a lot of material here that it should make for at least some interesting conversation. What are my thoughts of Jordan Peterson in general? Well, to be frank, I just don't know a whole lot about him. He strikes me as somebody, let me start off with some good things. He strikes me as somebody who is sincere and who is doing a great job in holding conversations with people that he disagrees with, and doing so in a productive and amicable way. You'll see this in this interview. You know, he's not shy about kind of pressing Bishop Barron on areas where he just thinks that that Bishop Barron is wrong. And same thing, to give credit to Bishop Barron. Bishop Barron as well is good at being forceful and pressing back. And I think that this dialogue is a good model of how productive disagreement should go, right? So you see people that they try to find common ground. They respect each other, but they're not babyish either about where they disagree. They're willing to press and be forceful in their disagreements, but not allow it to devolve into a bunch of just two children in a temper. So Peterson seems very good at that. He seems like a man that suffers a lot. And so I feel for him and I pray for him. It sounds like the past year of his life was extremely traumatic. I think I heard that he was in a coma and he struggled with addictions of anxiety medication. So I just want to extend, my prayers and sympathies to him. And probably I would guess that a lot of the suffering that he's going through is what's causing him to wrestle with so many of these deep existential questions. I mean, suffering is, of course, something that we all encounter profoundly in life. And it is one of the most gripping and terrifying metaphysical considerations, especially in light of God's existence, that we can possibly think about. And it strikes me that this is something that Peterson takes very seriously and that haunts him in a deep way. And I want to appreciate that and respect that as well. So other than that, I'm not too familiar with his work. I'm not a psychologist, so I can't analyze his academic work as a sort of Jungian psychologist. I'll have some remarks of how that I think bears in a little too heavily in how he thinks about religion, especially the historical credibility of religion. I think he sort of over psychologizes at points. And there, I think he's either just flat out wrong, or at least he's not realizing that there can be multiple layers of explanation to things. And Barron does a good point of that. So good to have you guys here again. Let me know what you're drinking. Let me know your thoughts on this conversation. I do want this to be a conversation as we move along. So I'll be checking in the live stream and just seeing what you guys are saying. So yeah, if you have any initial thoughts about Peterson and his relationship to religion right now, I'd be curious to hear them. I saw a lot of comments when this video is being shared around of people saying, "Oh, he's about to convert. He's on the cusp." I have no idea. I really don't know. But why don't we just start this? And do me a favor, let me know if you can hear this video. I've never done this before where I try to play a video and comment over it. So just help me out with the initial sound check. Here's the introduction.
So why do you think that people have written to you and to me suggesting that we converse? What's your take on this? It's surprising to me in some sense because it's not really my bailiwick, you know, although obviously I've been putting my nose in there anyways.
Real quick, can you guys hold on? Sorry.
As at least open.
Can you guys hear that? Okay, I just want to make sure the sound is coming through. If you do me a favor and like grunt in the comments that was audible. I just want to make sure that we're not having any tech issues right at the beginning. Would appreciate it. Okay, so we're going to start with this section because I think Barron makes a couple good points here, and Peterson, of course, just asked him, "Why do you think so many people want us to talk?" All right, seems like the sound is good. Awesome. We're going to continue then.
Opening a door to the religious dimension of life or a deeper dimension of life. I'll tell you a story. I got up in front of the bishops of the United States because I was chairman of our committee on evangelization. And I talked about why we're losing a lot of young people. I went through some of the statistics and then reasons why we're losing them. And then I gave various signs of hope. And one of the signs of hope I gave was, I called it the Jordan Peterson phenomenon. And what I meant was this. I told the bishops, here's this gentleman gets up in a pretty non-histrionic way and speaks for several hours in some cases about the Bible. And young people all over the English-speaking world are listening to him in theaters, and they're by their millions on YouTube. And I said, you know, I'm not here to endorse everything that Jordan Peterson is saying, but I think that in itself is a sign of hope. And so that became a source of some conversation among the bishops. But I do think it's a sign of hope. And I said to them, and it's really in some ways to our shame, that you were making the Bible more compelling and appealing in many ways than we were. You know, so that's our bailiwick. That's our profession, is the Bible. But you were opening the Bible up in a way that young people especially were finding very compelling. And you were indeed, I think, thereby opening a door toward a richer and fuller understanding of the scriptures. I think that's part of it. But I also think it's the opening to the realm of objective value. So I think as I read you and listen to you, you talk a lot about the objective realm of value. That's not simply a matter of my subjective whim, that I'll decide what to do, or I make up my values as I go along. But there's something about the tradition, something about what's been given to us, an objectivity to moral value, aesthetic value, intellectual value. And see, to me, it's in a good way, a gateway drug to religion, because God, I would say, is the ground and the source of objective value. And when you sort of hyper-subjectivize the whole operation, that becomes, questionable. So I think your work there, too, has sort of primed the pump for a deeper exploration of God as the source of these objective values. There's a couple thoughts I'd have about it, but I remember
Okay, very good. All right, a lot there. And before we actually hear Peterson, I just want to make a few remarks about that, because I think Bishop Barron is absolutely right. For those who are unfamiliar with Bishop Barron, by the way, he's going out there into the world, and he's having great conversations with people from all over the place. And I would highly encourage that you follow some of these conversations. I also write for his website occasionally, Word on Fire. In fact, one of my recent articles for them on the problem of evil. I'll link that in the comments there if anybody is interested in that. So I have a connection to their apostolate. And I think what he says is absolutely right, in the sense that at the very least, what we can admit is that Jordan Peterson has been something of a bridge or a mediating factor from people specifically away from what I think has been the new atheist movement. People who used to follow people like a Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins or Daniel Dennett, but still have, rightfully so, the soul's upward yearning, right? They're struggling with the big existential questions of life, and they're not satisfied with the reductionist materialist worldview. Peterson comes along from a not religious perspective, but he starts talking in very religious ways about this. So because he's not outwardly religious, I think that this this allows people to give him a hearing that they might not otherwise give to, frankly, somebody like me, who's just, I'm openly Catholic. Now, people will hear me out more so than not, just because they know my background of being previously an atheist. But Peterson, to me, seems a mediating factor. And in fact, we have a comment here that affirms this. Against Fascists says, he actually got me to come back to religion. He challenged atheism in a way that opened me up to the very idea of meaning. Then I saw him with William Lane Craig talking on the topic. That was a great exchange, by the way. Then I got to Edward Fazer. So that's exactly what I'm talking about. I've had comment upon comment upon comment, specifically from younger men on Instagram, email, saying it was Jordan Peterson who got me to reconsider that there's some plausibility to religion. He didn't convince me of it, but he opened me up and got me to take a second look. And once I took a second look, I took a third look, and then I took a fourth look, and then I got deeper and deeper, and then I got baptized and confirmed or something like that. So in that sense, I see Peterson as something of a bridge. Now, interestingly enough, he is the bridge that many people have crossed over, but he himself has not crossed over the bridge that he is. And maybe we'll get to that as we move along here. This next point is very interesting coming up because Barron's, he's talking about morality now, right? And this is a very big topic. And I think people struggle with, rightfully so, in an atheistic paradigm of how to make sense of our moral experience, of that judgment that some things are really good, other things really fall short or really bad, oftentimes horrendous, that there is a good life to be lived. And how do we make intelligible sense of that? And this is what Barron is hinting at here, with God as the sort of ground of objective morality. Now, when we say objective, we mean that something is sort of independent of our minds, right? Just to define some of the terms here. So, it is objectively true that 2 + 2 = 4, because that doesn't depend on me thinking about it, right? That was true before I even existed. It's true even if I think otherwise. That fact does not care about my feelings, is another way to put it. Whereas if we say that something is just purely subjective, then we say that, yeah, it's sort of thrown out there from our minds. It's contingent upon the way we think about things. It's the product of some socio-evolutionary process, but it has no real binding force on the structure of morality. Like we kind of foist that onto the world. It's something that we invent. It's not something that we discover. That's the key critical difference. So a lot of people who are coming from a sort of, and certainly this is something I struggle with a naturalistic background, is it really seems like we can make objective moral judgments, right, about some things being right or wrong. Maybe it's hard to discern how to evaluate all cases, but at least some cases seem obvious. Like, it just seems like child abuse is obviously a terrible thing. And that seems like something that is true independent of my opinion of it. And that if I somehow just thought or believed that child abuse was a good thing, that wouldn't change the fact that child abuse is really bad. Rather, it would just mean that I'm mistaken and that I need to change my mind so that way I better conform with reality. Now, if all reality is sort of the materialist paradigm of shapes and motions, fundamental particles and stuff like that, how are you ever going to get any type of moral standard from that? It seems like we have a construction problem where the materials on hand are insufficient or inadequate to give us the type of structure and reality that can make sense of the moral judgments that we make all the time, right? So we have a poverty of explanatory resources with the materialist worldview. Barron is saying that a lot of people realize this. To me, it's something that I realized myself as I was working through these philosophical issues, and that Peterson is serving as the bridge to help people see that maybe religion, broadly considered, or just theism, might offer some of the explanatory resources we need in the realm of morality. Now, let's see what Peterson has to say about this. Is this interesting so far, guys? I hope you're enjoying this.
As if we need a third category, subjective, objective, and something else that is an admixture of both. I mean, there's things, I come across information in the biological sciences particularly that speak deeply of an intrinsic morality. And you see this, you can look at the work of Frans de Waal, for example, who's a Dutch primatologist, and he's been studying the social interactions of chimpanzees. And
monkey.
Chimpanzees share a tremendous genetic overlap with human beings. And from an evolutionary perspective, we diverged from our
calling me a
ancestor
monkey
with chimpanzees something like 7 million years ago. Our cultures also share, or our biology also shares properties with that of bonobos, but I'm going to talk about the chimps for now. De Waal has been interested in what makes a chimp leader. So chimps organize their system.
Okay, I'm going to pause right here because I think this is where we can start to make some really interesting distinctions and clarify some of our moral thinking and moral epistemology and ontology. I think if you keep a few distinctions in mind, you'll be able to kind of see where I think Peterson is a little too stuck in the either or rather than both and category. One important distinction is this. Somebody, I think it was somebody brought up William Lane Craig, and Craig is good on this distinction between moral epistemology and moral ontology, right? So epistemology is a study of knowledge. How do we know what we know? How do we come to know what we know? What are the conditions of knowledge? Stuff like that. Ontology is the study of being as being, right? It's trying to study metaphysically the structures of reality. That's ontology, right? So these are different questions, right? When we ask a question of moral ontology, we're asking, like, is there an objective moral structure to the world, right, that can ground or make sense of our moral judgments as we commonly experience them, that can, some type of metaphysical anchor point or anchor points, depending how you want to think about it, where there is no fact value distinction anymore, right? We can say that something really is failing objectively. It doesn't meet our expectations. It's falling short. And then we can make a judgment, a correct judgment, that it is a bad action or that is a bad instance of its kind. That's ontology. Epistemology concerns, like, how do we know, how do we come to discover these moral truths, right? And then do we have an ethical framework that helps us to evaluate moral situations? That's moral epistemology. So when Peterson brings in evolution, I kind of want to cut it at its knees and say that this is just almost entirely irrelevant, right? Because there seems to be this tendency where people think that if we evolved into something, that gives the complete explanatory story. And to me, that's obviously totally false, right? Like, presumably we evolved to discover mathematical truths, right? But does that mean that mathematical truths are just something that we invent? Well, surely not, right? And surely we evolve to experience the world beyond our senses, right? The world outside of our mind. Does that mean that the world isn't really there, or that our senses or cognitive faculties aren't reliable? The answer is no. That isn't what we assume. So could you give an explanatory story of how we have evolved in our moral understanding of the world? I want to say you could. Yeah, certainly you can, right? But does that answer the ontological question? No, it answers part of the epistemological question. That we evolved to discover a moral structure to the world. But that doesn't answer the fundamental question, right? It doesn't answer of, well, what grounds that moral structure? How do we explain that moral structure, right? So sometimes what he's kind of bordering, what he's kind of tiptoeing around here is what's called a fallacy of Bulverism. And C.S. Lewis pointed this out. And the fallacy of Bulverism is this. It's that you start explaining why somebody is wrong without first showing that they are wrong. Like you just assume that something is wrong. And then you start trying to give some type of story, a psychological story or an evolutionary story or a sociological story about why they're wrong without first demonstrating the case that they are wrong, right? You've just assumed they're wrong, and then you start trying to tell a story about why they're wrong. The problem with the way I think Peterson thinks about morality comes from a faulty metaphysics where he thinks that if something can be given an explanation, even just a partial explanation in an evolutionary way, that is a complete or adequate explanation, full stop. So the fact that we have evolutionary explanations of some of our moral behaviors and the way we understand the world morally, I think Peterson thinks that somehow answers an ontological question, and it certainly doesn't, right? Because here's the way I put it, right? Did we evolve to discover something morally about the world, or did we evolve to invent moral fictions about the world? That's the critical question. Now, I want to say that if we're going to give an evolutionary story, that we evolved to discover, not to invent. I think Peterson is thinking that we evolved to invent, but that isn't a question that evolution can settle. That's what I want to be clear on. So this is where I think Peterson is just too narrow in his thinking, right? He needs to branch out. Like we can grant all the evolutionary story there, but it doesn't get at the heart of the question. Did we evolve to discover an objective, binding moral structure in the world, just like we evolved to discover many aspects that we think are true about the world? Or did we evolve to invent things that really have no objective moral binding force, right? And really are just useful fictions for keeping us alive. So like there's nothing, like in the latter, we'd say like there's nothing really wrong with child abuse. It's just useful for propagating the species. Of course, none of us believe that, right? We believe like, no, while it may certainly be useful for keeping the species a going concern, there's also something that like really truly horrendous about that, like objectively wrong. If you think that's right, there's something wrong with you. That's what we're talking about, right? And to my mind, I don't think Peterson has these distinctions clear in his mind. He's too caught up in one part of a possible epistemological explanation, and and sure, that might be part of the story, but it's so far from the complete story, and it doesn't answer the most fundamental question, which is this discovery or invention, or maybe some mix of both. So I just wanted to put that out there first. I hope that makes sense. Let me know your guys' thoughts on that in the comments. And by the way, this is totally a metaphysical question, right? Like evolution, again, does not solve this question. It could only solve this question if you put a philosophical layer on top of evolution, like naturalism or materialism. So if you're like, yeah, I believe in evolution plus materialism, therefore whatever morality is, it's going to be completely explained by this process. But it's that philosophical layer which is eminently contestable, right? Not the evolutionary sciences that it's themselves, right? It's that philosophical add-on, that sneaky philosophical layer or add-on. Alvin Plantinga is really good at calling this out. That's what needs to be challenged, right? That's the critical thing. Okay, sorry to interject so soon, but I just think that's such an important thing to talk about. Let's see what else Peterson has to say here.
Societies essentially in patriarchal fashion, the top chimp is male. That doesn't mean there aren't high status females. There are.
What is this ad here? Get out of here.
The fundamental power structure appears, let's say, patriarchal. And it's in the popular eye, it's easy to assume that the top chimp is the most physically intimidating. But that's actually not the case. What DeWall has shown is that alpha chimps who maintain stable sovereignty, let's say, are more engaged in reciprocal interactions than all the other chimps in the troop. So they're very generous and reciprocal. They play fair. Now, you can get the odd situation where a chimp troop will be ruled by a tyrant, but the structure becomes unstable, and the tyrant chimp tends to be overthrown by coalitions of other male chimps torn to pieces. And so then if you think, well, maybe there's a pattern that constitutes, this is the crucial issue as far as I'm concerned, is there a pattern of behavior that typifies stable sovereignty. And I think that's in some sense the fundamental religious question. Is there a pattern of behavior that constitutes stable sovereignty? And if so, what does it consist of? Jaak Panksepp has looked at rats.
Okay, we're just going to put it there before he talks about rats. And I just want to re-emphasize a couple of points. One thing is, in the previous clip, he said that he thinks we need some type of third category between the subjective and the objective. Put that aside. I don't think that right, that necessarily you're gonna get that. But there is a kind of a point here that I think is worth emphasizing, and that is that it's not like morality. And I want to be careful here. We don't want to like present too crude of a picture or make too crude of a move between the links between our moral experience and God, right? Because it's not like the way I think about morality anyways, and the right way I think about it isn't just a sort of crude divine command ethics, or that if you don't have God in the scene, then you have no reason for anybody to be well behaved, right? I think that that's far too quick and far too crude. Rather, what I think might appeal to Peterson and would be entirely complementary with all these evolutionary stories that he's talking about is a traditional natural law, right? And I talked about this a little bit with Jim Madden the other day, but let me just show the links real quick. Let me give you the brief and probably inadequate sketch, right? Is that we live in a world of essences and aims where things really have intelligible forms and structures. Like there's a substantial form, right, that I have, and it's something like rational animality, right? And given the kind of thing I am, given that first organizing principle of the what of my being, there is a specific effect or range of effects that I am aimed at by nature, right? One of those is to attain truth, right? And this is why we all say it's good to know true things, right? It's better to know the truth about things than to remain ignorant. Why? Because we're rational animals. And truth perfects reason. Reason is aimed by nature at truth. You follow? So that's why we say it is good for people to get the right answer to things, and it is bad for people to remain ignorant because they're failing to attain a certain perfection that relates to their nature. This is the traditional view of morality. It's an essentialism, right? It's an essentialism. So in the same sense that, let's take a stock example. You have the essence of triangularity, 3 straight sides, angles add up to 180 degrees, something like that, right? Somebody mentioned Ed Fazer. He gives this example a lot. Given the nature, like that there is an objective nature of triangularity. If I draw a triangle hastily, and it doesn't have very straight sides and not too sharp of angles, probably you guys would say, Pat, it's not a great triangle. It's actually a pretty bad triangle. And that wouldn't just be a matter of preference or opinion. You'd make that judgment because of that background, that essentialist background of there being an objective form of triangularity, right? So I wouldn't be able to legitimately tell you, nah, that's just your opinion, bro. That's just your truth. No, you'd be absolutely right. That is a crappy triangle. Now, if I took the time to use a protractor and a ruler, you'd say, okay, Pat, that's a much better triangle because it more closely approximates the exemplar, right? Okay, triangle, stock example. Humans are much more complicated, but same type of idea applies, right? There is really an intelligible organizing principle of what it means to be a human being, a human person. Traditionally, it has at least something to do with rational animality. Okay, so there's going to be certain behaviors, actions that we can perform that are going to either help perfect us as the kind of being that we are, truth-seeking is one of them, right? Or that will degrade us and that will cause us to fail, that will prevent our ultimate flourishing or completion. This is how you start to think of morality in an essentialist sense. So this is important because Peterson he sounds like he does want to ground morality in things themselves. And I want to say you should, right? Because what is good for something depends on its nature, on the kind of thing that it is. So what is good for me as a human being isn't necessarily what is good for a cow, isn't necessarily what is good for a tree, because those things have different natures, right? So, and morality only comes on the scene with rationality. Morality is a rational enterprise, right? So it's only when I can consider the space of reasons, the space of concepts, and choose between finite particular means to attain what is the ultimate good, my ultimate happiness, because we all seek happiness as sort of that ultimate end. Religious people believe that that ultimate end can only be attained by finding friendship with God and the beatific vision, because only God is the unconditioned good itself, the ultimate supreme good. So that's what we're ultimately after, right? But there's many ways that we can pursue that in life. And we're not determined to any one particular finite way of doing it. And this is kind of where freedom of the will comes in. We are determined to the ultimate good or happiness, right? We only do things insofar as we think that they're good. This will come up later in the conversation. However, among the finite particular things, we can choose X or not X. We could choose X or Y, or X or refraining from X, right? Because we can consider it under so many different conceptual alternatives, right? Think over and above any of the physical facts. So I'm looking at Peterson here. Whatever the physical facts are about Peterson, there's so many different ways I can think about him, that I can conceptually focus on him. I can think of him as a lecturer, a professor, a public speaker. I can do conjuncts, right? A lecturer and public speaker. I can think of him as a rabble rouser, as a contrarian, right? And depending on how I conceptualize or think about things, I can focus and kind of order myself or direct myself in one way or another. There's a whole complicated metaphysics of intellect and will that works with free will here, but this is how we're getting at it. The point is that morality only comes on the scene with rationality, because it's because of rationality that we can direct ourselves and, importantly, either choose well or choose poorly. It's because we are rational that we can either make better or worse judgments. This is why you don't have morality with non-rational beings. They still have goods, things that are goods for them. Like it's good for a hawk to grab a fish, right? But a hawk isn't a moral agent because presumably, from all we can tell, it doesn't have the ability to form conceptual concepts and reason via modus ponens and all these things that we have that are really different in kind, not just degree. So morality comes online with rationality and with the possibility that we can make better or worse decisions that will either cause us to flourish as the kinds of things we are or fall away from that, right? So you understand human nature, you understand that it is good for you to love your children, and that not only promotes the flourishing of your children, given their human nature, but it promotes your flourishing, giving your human nature. And this is why we can say the judgment to be a child abuser is objectively bad. And it's not just bad for the kid, it's bad for you, because that's not what is going to make you flourish as a human being who is ordered towards a human community that does require stability, like Peterson is pointing out in the evolutionary example. So there's a deep compatibility here. And what I would want to say is the metaphysics that I want to offer Peterson will help give him a theistic worldview that can make good sense of the evolutionary stories that he wants to tell. Better sense than a materialistic worldview, certainly, I would say, right? Now, where does God come in? God comes in as a sort of grand metaphysical ultimate that gives being and existence to these intelligible forms to begin with, right? So in a sense that you have the kind of four causes on the scene, efficient cause, material cause, formal cause, and final cause. And we have this universe of interrelated beings, of things that are ordered towards particular effects or ranges of effects to consistent repeated ends, right? An acorn never becomes a giraffe. It always is ordered towards becoming an oak tree. What Aquinas' move in his fifth way is, I said, given that immanent directedness, that immanent intelligibility and teleology, we need an organizing mind. We need an organizing mind to make sense of that immanent teleology, that immanent intrinsic intelligibility, and nothing but an organizing mind, a first, efficient, direct, and immediate cause of everything that exists, can ultimately explain that structure, the structure of the universe, but of course, both the formal and final causality pieces that we need. So that is I think the more accurate way of thinking of morality in relation to God. Now, you also have other, principles in the great tradition that are important as well, such as the convertibility between goodness and being, right? So goodness is sort of the actualization of a potential, right? Like it's good for me to acquire knowledge, and that actualizes a potential in me that perfects me as the kind of being that I am, right? So if we see that, goodness is just being considered as desirable, right? through the traditional metaphysical arguments, we get to God as being that which is purely and fully actual. And then with that convertibility principle, we also say that God is purely and fully good. But he's good in an analogous sense. He's not good like a good human is good, because we have a human nature. God doesn't. Put the incarnation aside, you know. So we attribute goodness to God analogically. Yes, God is really good. He's supremely good. He's as good as it gets. But he's transcendently good. So we don't want to like think of God as just like a bigger person with a lot of virtues that would be like a good example of like a just ruler in terms of a person who's a king. That's the wrong way to think about it. God explodes those types of limits. He isn't restricted to a nature. And you know, what is good for us is determined by our human nature, the kind of thing that we are. And there's just certain categories there that aren't going to apply to God. So, for example, one category is courage, right? Like, does God have courage? Well, it doesn't really make sense to say that God has courage, because courage only applies to beings that are finite, contingent, and that it would make sense for them to face up or confront certain dangers to promote their flourishing. And those things don't apply to God. God could never be in danger. God isn't finite. So God doesn't need courage. Like, courage isn't a category that applies to God. Courage is something that applies to us in prudence, understanding our situations and that we could be in danger, and that the wise, prudent thing to do in certain situations is to act in spite of fear. And that's where courage becomes a virtue. So there's often a lot of I know I just dumped a whole bunch on the table, but there's a lot of just confusion between the links in morality and God. But the way I would say it is this: the way from morality to God is to make sense of morality. We're going to need a metaphysics that includes essentialism, that we live in a world of forms and natures to help us make sense of that objective judgment of why certain things are good or bad, given their relation to the kind of thing in question. And teleology, that things really are directed to certain ends that is their proper perfection. And then once you have those sort of metaphysical beams in place, you have to ask, well, what keeps those up? And that's when you're going to need God as a supreme first principle, efficient cause, and organizing intellect of all of that grand scheme, that metaphysical scheme, right? So that to me is the proper way to proceed from an analysis of morality to God, rather than just saying, if God doesn't exist, you can't be a good person. That, to me, that just seems way too crude. A number of people can do many good things, even absent belief in God. However, I will want to say that our ultimate goodness does depend on our worship and belief in God, because nothing else is going to make us perfectly and ultimately happy aside from being with God in the beatific vision. So if you want to have the truly and ultimately good life, yes, religion does need to be a part of that. Sorry, did that make any sense? Give me some feedback in the comments, guys. Let's see what you guys are saying here in the chat. This is fun, by the way. SH says, I think Peterson brings many young people to seriously consider religious texts. This is a good thing in my book. I completely agree. I've got nothing but good things to say about Peterson there. I know he has this Bible lecture series. I haven't listened to it, but I've gotten so many comments from people saying, I started with that and then I got baptized, right? And this seems to be a common theme even in the comments here today. Logical, plausible, probable says, this is why the second you remove, quote, evolution from the equation, all this collapses and theism is the only plausible explanation of morality. So I'm not even wading into the different debates or critiques that could be had about the various evolutionary stories on offer. I want to say that even if we concede all of it, it's still not going to give us an adequate explanation of our moral experience, right? There's at the very best, it's always going to be incomplete. So what I want to do is I just want to say, we can just put all that to one side. Now, maybe there are some very good and powerful and interesting critiques to that story in and of itself. And personally, I think that there are, but I want to just say, let's just not even get into that mess. Let's just put it aside and see that it's largely irrelevant to morality properly considered, unless somebody is sneaking in or smuggling in some type of philosophical or metaphysical add-on over and above what the actual empirical science is. So that's why I'm fine with Peterson telling all these stories and not, working through all of those bit by bit, because to me, it's just not even particularly germane to the overall conversation. Guys, there's no way we're going to be able to get through this entire video. We're only like 7 minutes into that video, and we're already how long? We're already 40 minutes worth of talking here. But I hope this is interesting to you guys. If so, do me a favor and like and subscribe and all that. All right, let's let Peterson go on a little bit more now.
Rat behavior, and rats, juvenile male rats, engage in rough and tumble play. And when you pair them together, if one rat is 10% bigger than the other, he can dominate the lesser rat. And so they do that, and they establish their relative dominance. And then if you repeatedly pair them together, which is a crucial issue, it has to be repeated pairings. The lesser rat has to invite the dominant rat to play. So that's his role, and the larger rat agrees and plays. But if the larger rat doesn't let the little rat win 30% of the time across repeated play bouts, the little rat will stop playing. And what I read that, it just blew me away. It's so significant because it shows, imagine that part of what morality is. Morality is precisely that pattern of behavior that serves to keep repeated interactions going. And those repeated interactions might be across days or weeks or months or years or decades or centuries or eons, a tremendously long time span. And so what you get is the emergence of a pattern of behavior that's stable for.
That's definitely not what morality is, right? Or it's not entirely what the moral story is. Now, I'm not going to repeat everything I just said. I'll let you guys connect the dots between what I said and how Peterson is describing this. But we have to, again, differentiate sort of like what the moral norms are, how we affirm an objective moral structure to reality, how we come to know how we, in our human history, came to discover or come in contact with that objective moral structure, and then what type of ethical frameworks or theories help us to, do the moral parsing, right? Now, is morality often very useful? Well, yeah, I think so. And like, that's sort of the thing that we should expect, given that God is perfectly wise. He's not going to just create a world of complete, ridiculous nonsense and chaos. So like, it shouldn't be surprising that when people act morally, there is a great stability and sustainability that sort of comes out of that, right? So it is concomitant with or corresponds with morality, but again, I think he's being too reductionistic here, and he hasn't thought deeply enough about. This is where it would pay to be a generalist, right? Like, let's get out of psychology and evolutionary theory for a little bit, and let's spend some time on metaphysics and ethics. And I think that this would help connect a lot of dots for Dr. Peterson and help him to kind of expand his thinking to see that at the very least, there's great compatibility here, and there's more to the explanatory story. He just seems too restricted in the way that he's thinking, too dichotomous, too either or both and. Does that sound like a fair critique to you guys? Again, chime in. Let's let him keep going.
For the individual and stable for society. And that, as that's instantiated more and more deeply, it becomes something we can observe and something that we adapt to and something that then becomes part of our central nature. And for me, that's the way into that's the bridge between biology and religion right there. And because it looks like there's an evolved ethic that even goes beyond human beings. Yeah.
So before, I probably will skip Barron's comments, not because they're not good. I just don't want to make this video longer than it needs to be. Again, what is the conflict, right? That there is an evolutionary story to our moral history, to our cognitive capacities, in which we engage in moral reasoning. So I just want to keep repeating how important it is to make these distinctions between moral ontology, moral epistemology, and is there shared, moral commitments across species? Again, I want to say that depends, right? Because morality only makes sense where there is rationality, where rationality is on the scene. So yeah, there can be certain things that are good for other animals that are good for us, but we don't consider other animals moral agents because they lack rationality, right? So it doesn't really make sense to call them moral agents or to say that there's a shared ethic or moral system there. That's just confusing categories. And part of this is just a lot of kind of moral philosophy now is just is confused in many different ways. Even I talked about this with Jim in a couple podcasts ago. It's like even just the term value, I think, is unhelpful in moral discourse because it's kind of imported from economics and has a lot of subjectivist residue. Whereas in the classic tradition, you really just hear about the good of something according to its nature, what something is, what a flourishing example of something is. And how we know what that is, so we can relate it to failing examples or defective examples, right? So just another kind of quick stock example, right? If that there's a norm, and there's a real intelligible norm given the former essence of a thing. If a dog is born with 3 legs, we don't say that that's just a different species or that's just a way that dogs, some dogs are. Well, certainly it's the way that some dogs are, but we also say that something's gone wrong. It is defective in a sense. Doesn't mean we don't love the dog, we don't care for the dog, but something has failed, something is missing that should be there, which is a 4th leg, right? And that makes sense given a natural law perspective, right? Given that there is a norm, right, of dog nature, and within that norm involves having 4 legs. And so if a dog only has 3 legs, then we say that something has gone wrong. There's a privation here. That would otherwise be proper for the dog. Now, and let's just draw another example, right? Is it bad for me to remain ignorant and to not try and seek knowledge? Yes. Is it bad for a tree to remain ignorant? No, because a tree doesn't have a rational nature. So you don't count a tree as failing because it doesn't know arithmetic, right? That's just not relevant to the nature of a tree. And the reason I'm drawing these distinctions, I think they're really helpful to just kind of parse through a lot of the ambiguity that I think Peterson is stuck in when it comes to moral thinking. He just keeps coming back and blurring all these distinctions because, again, he's just coming at it from just like one very particular perspective, which is an evolutionary psychological perspective. And again, not saying that isn't part of the story, but if you're just going to try and reduce morality to that, you're always going to have, at best, an inadequate explanation. Okay. So, we will listen to Barron just for a little bit here.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't deny for a second there's a biological ground for a lot of this business. And I'm with Lonergan, the great Canadian philosopher, that the condition for the possibility of real objectivity is a properly constituted subjectivity. So I like your opening comment about something that bridges the two. We don't just live in, the subjective and objective as though they're discrete. But it's a properly constituted subjectivity, which means one free of various prejudices, one free of various fears, one free of games of self-denial and all that can properly intuit the objective value. And objective value does indeed come up out of the physical to some degree. I mean, we're embodied creatures. So the biological plays a role in that for sure. But I think, too, it goes beyond it. I mean, it goes beyond simply a question of survival of the individual or even of the species, but certain values, of the truth and beauty and the good that transcend that, although they're grounded in it for sure.
Well, this is one of the things I really wanted to ask you about because
of course, Bishop Barron is spot on there. And anybody who brings up Lonergan is fan in my book. Bernard Lonergan is one of the most genius philosophers and theologians of the past 100 years. There's no doubt. He profoundly shaped my thinking. Just get and read his book Insight and read it for the next 10 years, and you will still not fully tap its wealth of treasures and insights. That's Bernard Lonergan Insight. Now, yes, of course, so much of our of what is good for us. He used the term value again. It's kind of a pet peeve. What is good for us as humans is going to involve a lot of biology and physical facts, right? It's good for us to assimilate nutrition, right? That's why we can say that something like bulimia is bad, right? Because we have this power that is meant to, assimilate nutrition, which is really good for us. And so we're kind of perverting a faculty, right? We're just, taking advantage of the means that sometimes gets us to eat, which is the pleasure of eating, and then just disordering that natural faculty away from its proper end, which is, of course, to give us nutrition, to be healthy, right? So a lot of morality does have to do with just the physical facts. There's no doubt about that, or the biological facts. And in that sense, from an essentialist worldview, science does have something to say about morality, right? Because it can investigate certain empirical details about what it might be good for us when it comes to certain physical facts, and that can inform what actions may be better or worse, even with things like diet or exercise or something like that, because all that is so sometimes people say science has nothing to say about morality. I want to say no, it doesn't have anything to say about the sort of ontology or metaphysics of morality. But once we have a proper moral understanding in place, I would argue a traditional natural law, there's many areas there that are open to empirical investigation, and science can be really helpful for that. However, it isn't in the sense that, like Sam Harris would say, right? That science can just give us an objective morality. That's, if you want an exercise in equivocation, you can just read his book, The Moral Landscape, where he just defines the good as certain brain states. And that's clearly false, right? Because we can imagine certain situations where people have positive brain states or a sense of happiness in a very subjective sense when they're doing supremely evil and wicked things, like abusing a child. So whatever else the good is, it's not something that is reducible to certain brain states or subjective feelings. The good in traditional natural law and traditional ethics, which I think is correct, is something that we can take an objective third-person perspective on, right? Now, a lot of our desires and will sort of line up with what is good. I mean, that's just kind of what is to be expected. But like how other parts of us can fail, like how I can have poor eyes, right? So like it's bad. I have bad eyes. I have bad eyes. Given what the nature of eyesight is, there's a norm there that I'm failing to reach. And it doesn't offend me to say that I have bad eyes. That's why I wear glasses, right? Well, other things can go wrong too. We can have disordered or defective desires as well. Our desires can become disordered to certain actions and behaviors that are really bad for us, like abusing children. So we have to break free of this radically subjectivist view of morality. It's pernicious, it's evil, and it's obviously wrong. Let me put my glasses back. Now, there is sometimes an objection against natural law, saying, Pat, you're a natural law theorist, but you're wearing glasses, and glasses aren't natural. See, haha, refuted. And that's a stupid objection because it has nothing to. It's another equivocation, right? When we talk about nature in natural law, we mean natures, an objective essence. We don't mean like something is natural that we only made it out of grass and bamboo, right? That's not what we mean, or it comes from mother. That isn't what we mean at all. And in fact, it's good for me to wear glasses because glasses help to restore the proper functioning of my eyes, right? So there's a very functional concept of the good in traditional natural law, a very functional concept. So it's good for me to wear glasses because it sort of restores the proper functioning of my eyes, right? Because it's good for me to see. I like to see. It's hard for me to do it without my glasses. Quick comment from Logical, Plausible, Probable. He says, I agree it wouldn't remove the cause of objective morality. I'm just saying that the new atheists cling to evolution as a way around it. You know, Alvin Plantinga's got a good saying about this, and I think he's right. For the naturalist, for the new atheist, you know, evolution is like the only game in town. It's like the only thing that can help get their story going. Now, the nice thing about theism is like it's independent of that. Like if you know, again, you can concede the entire evolutionary story, and that's entirely compatible with all of your traditional theistic commitments. Or parts of the evolutionary story could be wrong, or significant chunks, and theism, you know, is still there. It's unaffected by it. However, if evolution comes up inadequate in some sense or faces significant difficulties, and evolution, let's be clear, is an accordion term. It means different things. It can mean, of course, common ancestry, descent with modification, or it can mean a particular mechanism, right? And like what drives it, and you know, the mechanism being selection working on random mutation. So when people critique evolution, you have to kind of ask them, well, what aspect of evolution are you critiquing? Because somebody might just critique the mechanism. Other people might critique common ancestry or something like that. But the point is, and this is to your point, is like, if parts of that story start to fall apart, it's really hard to see what the naturalist has left. And that's why Plantinga says it's the only game that they can play, right? So like it has to work. It has to be true, right? Because come hell or high water, it's got to be true, or else we're going to have a really hard time with the story, this metaphysical story we want to tell. And that's why it's so cherished to them, right? That's why I think they get so triggered and agitated when anybody does pose serious empirical difficulties, like people like Michael Behe has, which I've had on this channel to debate many times. I'm quite sympathetic to a number of his critiques. So don't get me wrong. I think that there are serious issues with parts of the story. And I think that that is a serious issue for a naturalist and a materialist. But at the same time, I want to say we can just, and I know you know this, but I just want to say we can just bracket all that, or we could even just concede the entire story and say it still isn't adequate. It's still not enough. And I think that's useful to do, because if you don't have to like wade into these different issues and you can just kind of like cut right to the heart of the matter, I think that does a lot of good and that's what I'm trying to do in this conversation. So I hope that makes sense. Against Fascist says, I'm going to try and get my wife to watch this. I'm super Catholic, uber Catholic, brother. Cheers. And she is agnostic. She's held back by Catholic morality, and this is extremely well articulated. Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, the Catholic Church has, always stood by and defended and articulated this traditional natural law morality, and I think it's the only, unless you want to just kind of hop to like a divine command ethics, which people are going to have a lot of issues with. I think traditional natural law is the only way that you're going to get a systematic, coherent, and compelling ethical, both ontology and epistemology, and that comes with a cost, and that cost is that you will need theism to bear that out at the end of the day. And the Catholic, and this didn't start by Christians, by the way. Like you find roots of this in the pagans and the Greeks, the Stoics especially, and then the church has just said, look, well, hey, God designed the world. Of course, things have nature. So the church has always been great about bringing in those aspects of the world that are obviously true, even if they didn't originate in a Christian context, and saying, here's how this fits, right? And natural law makes sense because God made us with reasoning souls. Like, we should be able to figure out a good amount of the good life apart from direct revelation, right? So revelation, the relation between revelation and morality is that it sort of super adds to what we can know through reasoning about morality. So, for example, let's take the category of religious worship. Most, cultures, most societies, most people have realized that God exists, that there's good reasons to believe that. And that because God exists, he's given us everything. He's given us absolutely everything. And it's pure gratuitous surplus. Everything that we have that is good, we owe to God. He is owed our gratitude, our veneration, our thanks, our worship. This, by the way, is when Aquinas talks about religion, he puts it under the category or the virtue of justice, not feeling, not sentiment. He puts it under the category of justice. And justice is, of course, giving to somebody what they are due. And it is good for us, given our nature, to be just. It perfects us to be just. Now, justice often involves giving punishment, if that's due, but also involves giving positive things as well. Like if I have an employee, I owe them a just wage if they do good work. Of course, I owe my kids a proper moral formation, and I owe them injustice and a proper education. What do we owe God? Right? That's the question. Well, we owe him everything, right? And this is why religion, broadly considered, is under the category of justice for Aquinas. So this is why I want to say, no, you can't be a fully good person without religion. Now, where does revelation come in? Revelation comes in because it's just God saying, okay, here's how I want you to fulfill this obligation. Here's how I want you to worship me. Here's how I want you to relate to me. Join my church. Avail yourself of the sacraments. It's just adding specificity to something that we can know generally, right? It's adding specificity to something that we can know through reason apart from religion generally. That's how revelation sort of specifies the obligation, the moral obligation that we can know generally just through rational reflection on the universe and ourselves. It's analogous to the Trinity in a sense, right? So like we can through reason get to a robust monotheism, classical theism, as I've talked about on this podcast many times, but we don't really have access to the inner life of God. But then if God directly reveals something about his inner life, we see that it just goes beyond or adds more content to what we could know generally through reason. It's not in conflict with it. It just adds to it. It's on the far side of reason. That's exactly what Barron will say as we move along here. I hope that's helpful. I forget what the original comment was. Kind of got off on a roll there. Against Fascist says, sorry, Pat, which Lonergan book? Well, all of them, but start with Insight. Lonergan's book, Insight, is just, it'll blow your mind. And it is largely an epistemological project. And he's kind of responding to Kant. But it's a tremendous, tremendous volume. If you're interested in Problem of Evil and Predestination, then get Grace and Freedom as well while you're at it. Patrick says the church doesn't really take our feelings into account. This is, and he's saying that's not a bad thing. Look, this is true because our feelings, our desires can become disordered. And we all know this. Did God give us a guide to help us flourish? And what we should see of the sort of moral rules or bounds that the church sets is just a blueprint for our flourishing. And it says, hey, if you really want to be happy, then you should follow the dictates of the natural law. We all want to be happy. This is in us by nature. We can't avoid seeking our own happiness. And then the question is, well, what will cause us to be ultimately and truly happy? And the answer is follow the dictates of the natural law. Do that which will perfect you as the kind of thing you are. And the church just provides those specifications. It's there to give you the flourishing and the freedom. And if your feelings or desires don't match up with that, that's on you. Right. And that was on me before I became Catholic. Look, it wasn't like I was some holy, pious saint. When I was verging on Catholicism, I realized, I got a lot of stuff out of alignment here. And I'm going to need a lot of help from God to get this stuff straight. And by God's grace, he'll help you do it. He'll help you do it. You don't pull yourself up by your bootstraps as a Catholic, right? Gratia prima, grace first. Cooperation, important. But you really just let God work within you there. Sorry, we're kind of veering off into some little more theology than was intended. But I suppose this is a blend episode between philosophy and theology. After all, as Aquinas would say, philosophy is just a handmaid to theology. Let's see what Dr. Peterson has to say now.
I do think in evolutionary terms and across the time scale that evolutionary biologists and physicists have come to accept. And so that's a universe that's about 15 billion years old on a planet that's about 4.5 billion. And with life being 3.5 and mammalian life, say, being 60 million years, that's my time span. The biblical time span is much truncated in relationship to that. And that sets up a certain tension between the biblical stories, certainly if they're read as objective truth. Yeah. But the Catholic Church, from my understanding, has, and this comes from the Pope himself, the Catholic Church has already accepted the basic tenets of evolution. But I don't know, yes, is that wrong?
Sure. Oh, no, absolutely.
Yes. Okay. So, but that begs the question, because for me, and I'm sure this is part of the sticking point for young people, and maybe for people in Western culture in general, is that it's easy to say that evolutionary theory has been accepted, but that still begs the question. It's right. Okay. So fine. You can look at the span of life over 3.5 billion years before you get to human beings. But our religious stories talk of a reality that looks like it's about 15,000 years old, something like that.
Right.
And so that, I'm not blaming the church for that, obviously. And I think the stories in the Bible are far older than 5,000 to 10,000 years.
All right, just a quick remark on this. I have no idea where he's getting this from. But then again, I don't necessarily fault him because he's not in a Catholic paradigm. But this is certainly a residue of a sort of fundamentalism that is certainly still fairly prevalent in America, at least. The Catholic Church says you can go wherever you want on the evidence for evolution, right? It leaves that entirely open. And when it comes to the Bible, very important to realize that the Bible isn't a book. It's a collection of books. It span many different genre categories. We have Greco-Roman biography. We have poetry. We have myth in the truest sense, as Saint Pope John Paul II told us. So, like, how you should read a book of the Bible, as Bishop Barron says, depends entirely on what section of the library you are in, right? Like, are you in the poetry section, or are you in the Greco-Roman biography section? Because whether or not you should take something not just literally, but literalistically, right, will depend on the genre or the category of the book itself, right? So if you think that you should just read the Bible all in the same way, I think we were already fundamentally off to a terrible start, right? That's definitely not the case. Furthermore, it is just very important to note that throughout the tradition, and we can point back to St. Augustine on this, right? It was quite clear that that there were internal indicators in Genesis for why we should not read the creation story as like a literal 6 days, right? And St. Augustine said this. St. Augustine said this some 1,500 years before Darwin was ever on the scene, right? And you can just tell that from the text with the creation, the ordering of the creation of the sun and the day and night and this or that. So this is just something of kind of a modern issue. And that's not to say that nobody in the tradition ever thought that it could be interpreted literalistically. Of course, in the tradition, there's just various people with various positions on this. But I think it's just really important to point out here that this is a pseudo problem. This isn't, it's only a problem for those who are committed to a very fundamentalist, literalistic interpretation of everything in the Bible, which I think is extremely problematic and obviously wrong for many other reasons. So I'm not going to spend much time on this because I think it's such a pseudo problem, but it is always worth, just hanging a lantern on that because it seems to be a stumbling block for many people.
I suspect they were part of an extraordinarily ancient oral tradition that stretches back tens of thousands of years, because that's the rule rather than the exception. And I don't know to what degree the Catholic thinkers within the church are working constantly to attempt to reconcile these two viewpoints, apart from saying that they do accept them both.
Yeah, but I don't think I think that they're apples and oranges in a way. I mean, I don't worry too much about that issue. I'm not trying to read the Bible as a scientific text. It's not about the evolutionary process. It's a theological and spiritual text that's discerning truths that are, I think, available within our experience. But they're discrete moments there. I mean, the scientist who talks about evolution, fine.
Yeah, real quick, like what are some of those truths that Genesis is really trying to convey? Like, what should we really get out of Genesis? One, man is made in the image and likeness of God, right? There is really something special about us, something extremely dignified, infinitely valuable, right? And this, of course, is enormously important morally for Western civilization, right? Because that wasn't something that was assumed in many other cultures for a very long time, right? The idea that all human beings, in virtue of being human beings, created in the image and likeness of God, had inherent, intrinsic, infinite worth, right? That is not a shared commitment necessarily across cultures, right? But also Genesis is really harping upon, and it's playing upon other myths too, right? People say, well, look, there's similar myths. Of course, like they know that, but they're clarifying it in the sense that what we have in Genesis is creation ex nihilo, right? And a profound pronouncement of divine authority and aseity, right? One God, creator of everything else apart from himself, right? So it is giving us a metaphysics and a philosophical anthropology, but it is not giving us an astrophysics or an evolutionary biology. And these distinctions are enormously important, right? Because if you look for the latter in Genesis or the Bible generally, you're always just making a profound category mistake. You're always going to be deeply confused. But if you're looking to see if God has revealed any deep truths metaphysically or about philosophical anthropology, the nature of humanity, or the relationship that we have between ourselves and God and the history of that relationship, that's what are these deep spiritual truths that Barron is talking about. But you're not supposed to read it, and you absolutely should not read it as a scientific textbook. That's just a horrible
listen
mistake.
to him or her. The Bible's not concerned so much with that, but it's giving us a theological interpretation of history and indeed of the cosmos, but not in scientific terms. So it has implications for our understanding of the cosmos for sure, and of nature, of human nature, but it's not done in a scientific manner. So it just predates, as you say. I mean, any of what we'd associate now with the scientific method, the last biblical text is around the year 100 AD. And so it long predates that preoccupation. So to me, it's like kind of an apples and oranges issue. And I think that a lot of that religion science stuff in that sense is an early 20th century preoccupation that we should just get beyond.
Right. But I think that may be the case, but I don't think people have gone beyond it. And,
No,
I also think that, and this pertains to something we also talked about discussing, which was the continual drain from the church, the Catholic Church, perhaps in particular, but perhaps not in the West, of young people. And I think part of that is their inability to make intellectual sense of everything that they're faced with, a religious tradition and a scientific tradition, especially on the biological front. But not only that, they don't know where to place these things in their view of the world. I think that's partly why my lectures, because you'd asked about that, had become popular, because I am trying to do that. And
no, I'll say this. You look at the surveys, there's a lot of surveys now that ask young people precisely that question: how come you left? And people speculate, oh, it must be because of the scandals, or because they had a bad experience in church or something. Number one reason across many years in all the surveys is, I don't believe the teachings. And then to specify that, religion and science seem to be at odds with each other. So for young people, the scientific way of knowing is the way of knowing. So it's sort of scientism, at least implicitly, holds sway in the minds of a lot of young people. So once you make that move, knowledge equals the scientific manner of knowing. Well, then the Bible is non-scientific, therefore it's, old superstition, Bronze Age mythology, etc. And see, what you were doing, Jordan, I think, you were doing what a lot of the church fathers did with the scriptures, because the church fathers are very interesting. People like Origen and Augustine and Chrysostom and those people.
Yeah, let me pause it here. First, let's tend to a few comments, because I appreciate this is fun, guys. I wasn't sure how this would go trying to stream the video and talk over it, but it seems like things are working out, and I appreciate the ongoing conversation here. And then we'll chime back in on, I want to just remark upon Bishop Barron's remarks on scientism. Against Fascist says, yes, Patrick, I joined the church based on feeling and prayed that I could better understand the moral obligations. I assented to them, but didn't understand them at the time. So, hey, man, I relate to this. When I was, again, veering towards Catholicism, it was not based necessarily on feelings. I mean, there's always deep feelings and emotions at play, right? So it wasn't some like Spock-like conversion of just pure deduction by any means. But the teachings made sense to me, but I either didn't want to do it, right? It's a classic St. Paul line, like, why do I do the things I don't want that I know are bad for me? So I either didn't want to do them, I didn't want to change my life, or I didn't think that I could, right? Of these various kind of sins that I was engaged in. But I'll tell you what, man, you open yourself up, you don't resist, you ask for God's help. He's helped me overcome a lot of stuff that, frankly, I don't think I ever would have been able to. Far from canonization at this point. So we're doing our best every day, but that experience I had of giving up the resistance utterly convinced me of the efficaciousness of grace and operative grace and all that. Erich, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, says, what if some of the principles of natural law that we discover through the natural sciences were to contradict Christian teaching? Would you say that situation is metaphysically impossible? Yeah, I think so. I think that you're never going to get more metaphysics out of science than you put in. I think that is generally absolutely correct. I think that you're only going to pull out as much metaphysics into science as you put in. Now, if you have prior metaphysical commitments, science can offer clarifications and specifications. Again, if you're already a committed essentialist and you kind of have the outlines of what human flourishing is all about, again, science can fill in some of the details to help you, better understand what is really going to be good for you, especially as related to kind of our physical embodiment. But yeah, no, I don't think that you're going to get any major metaphysical revisions through the sciences themselves. I think that you got to do metaphysics to get your metaphysics straight. But that's a good question. Chad says, I think that Peterson is repeating the popular belief that the stories in the Old Testament are based on Sumerian myths. Like, there's definitely a lot of, I'm not an Old Testament expert by any means, but again, there's nothing wrong with the playing upon or responding to a lot of these other creation myths. There are other creation myths, but what's important is to see how Genesis is relevantly different, right? Excuse me, I have to cough. A lot of these other creation myths are, not just one God, but multiple gods, and not, creation out of nothing, but creation out of some pre-existing material. And so we could say, in a sense, that there's similarities and there's crossovers, but there's important correction, right? So again, I think this is kind of something where we should be open to a little bit more of a both and rather than an either or on some of this stuff. Now I have to remember what Barron said about scientism. Yeah. Oh yeah. So about people leaving the church. Yeah. I mean, Peterson is right in a sense that church leadership has failed enormously in articulating the rich intellectual tradition of the Catholic Church. So I just want to make an important distinction, right? Is that there's a failure on the practical level, but not a failure on the theoretical or metaphysical level. Like, all these issues, all these science issues, there's really good answers to them. I'm holding a wonderful book right here that's using to prop my computer up called Aristotle's Revenge by Edward Fazer, The Metaphysical Foundations of Physical and Biological Science, where he argues for a lot of the stuff that not only I've been arguing for, but he's going to say that not only is this worldview, is this metaphysics completely compatible with the physical sciences, but the physical sciences very often not only presupposes it, but absolutely requires it to be even sensible to begin with. So if this is something you're deeply interested in, I would commend that book to you. I think it's a phenomenal book. However, and this is where I agree with Peter, and this is the points where I agreed with Peterson most in this interview. We're not going to, we'll do a part 2 probably, because there's so much more to cover. But eventually he gets around to other failures in church leadership. And when he's talking about the failures in church leadership, I find myself just nodding my head in strong agreement. Intellectual failures, moral failures, all of this. Now, of course, if you're familiar with the history of Christianity and the Old Testament, you always realize that the story of God's people, that salvation history is just one, egregious, enormous failure after another. And yet God still somehow, to use a cliche, always draws straight with crooked lines. So failures, scandals, they're sad to horrible, but they also aren't something without precedent. They aren't something that should surprise us. God created us with natures. Our nature is naturally fallible in our reasoning, in our deliberations. A wise God governs things according to their nature. He allows us, he permits our failures because he can draw goods from it, greater goods from it. And it is good. It is good to guide things and govern things according to the types of thing that they are. Could God constantly intervene and perform constant miracles to make sure that we never make a wrong decision? Yes, but then he isn't letting us be us. And then it doesn't really make sense of why he would even make us to begin with. And God doesn't do things that don't make sense. If he's going to make us, we're going to be naturally fallible. There's always going to be the possibility that we could fail. And there's going to be a significant degree of autonomy allowed precisely because God has made a world of natures. And only God, as a subsistent good, is his own rule. Only God is naturally impeccable. Anything that God creates that is a moral agent, capable of reasoning, is from human beings to aliens, if they're out there and they're rational, to the angels, are naturally fallible, right? They aren't their own moral rule because they aren't subsistent goodness itself or subsistent truth itself like God is. They're creatures, they're contingent. And so a wise God governs things according to their nature. And God couldn't make a naturally impeccable being any more than he could make a square circle. It doesn't even make sense because only God, since there can only be one God, is subsistent goodness and subsistent truth itself. So everything else is going to be naturally fallible, right? And God governs us in this way, moves us in accord with our nature. And sometimes we do fail. Sometimes we fail horribly. But God is, of course, so omnipotent that he can work with this. And he works with it even in his own church, even among his own people. And for me, this is such an important thing, because if you're evaluating Catholicism, you have to look through the failures, practical and moral, of the people in the church and ask yourself the more fundamental question of, is this God's church? Is this God's church? Now, the failures are egregious and horrible, and doesn't mean that we're to be indifferent to them. But if you're going to evaluate a worldview or a belief, Catholicism, then you have to ask, what does that actually teach, or what does it predict? Does the Catholic worldview teach or predict that all of its members, all of its leadership, all of its clergy will be morally impeccable and right on everything? No, it doesn't predict that at all. So some data point X can't count against a hypothesis unless that hypothesis predicts not X. So disregarding Catholicism because of the failures of members in the church, laity, clergy, all the way up to the Pope, is not fairly evaluating what the Catholic Church actually teaches, which is that God gave us the Catholic Church, God gave us the Eucharist, and God guides his church on, here's the important part, the essential matters of faith and morals. That's the doctrine of indefectibility, not the doctrine of impeccability for any of the members, but the doctrine of indefectibility, that when the church teaches in her full authority on faith and morals, she cannot and will not ever lead people into error, right? She will not ever bind people into error. And that is a gift for us. That's not a gift for the Pope, even though indefectibility extends to papal infallibility. People think that papal infallibility is like some special gift for the Pope because he's a holy and special person. That's not it at all. Infallibility extends from indefectibility as a gift for us, so that way we can have the blueprint that we need for our flourishing and our happiness, and so that we will never have to choose between schism and heresy. And when you understand indefectibility and infallibility that way, that's a beautiful thing. Of course, that makes sense that God would give us such a gift, because if God's going to reveal something, he's probably going to want us to be able to make sense of that revelation over time, especially since, we weren't left with a New Testament, right? We were left with a church. And even if we were left with just a New Testament, you have issues of interpretation, you have issues of compilation, you have issues of application. So it seems like we need another mechanism. That mechanism is, of course, the magisterial teaching authority of the church to provide those guidelines, the moral guidelines, but also not just the what to do, but how to do it. That is the grace through the sacraments, communion, confession, all of that. What the heck was I talking? What was the original point? I totally forget what the original point was, and we somehow got into indefectibility. I'm just going to play the video for a couple more minutes, and then we'll probably wrap this section up.
They knew fully well in the 3rd and 4th century that the Bible should not simply be read in a sort of, straightforwardly literalistic way. Augustine knew that very clearly. Origen knew that clearly. And they talked, therefore, about the different senses of Scripture. What you're doing, I think, in a lot of your lectures is what Origen would have called the moral sense of the Bible, the tropological, to give it its kind of technical term. The biblical texts are about the moral life. Now, we might say today the psychological life, or what makes you psychologically healthy or more productive. They would have said the moral sense. They knew all about that. And so the texts begin to open up in these marvelous ways. So, Noah and the ark, Jacob and wrestling with the angel and the ladder going up to heaven, et cetera, et cetera. If you start fussing about, the literal truth of these stories, you're going to miss these really deep spiritual insights, which the church fathers knew very well. And I think you were in your own way tapping into that. And the fact that young people were responding to it, I think is very encouraging. That's why I told the bishops, it's a positive sign that you were getting the audiences you were getting around this.
Well, the problem with the scientific viewpoint, technically speaking, is that it's amoral within its own confines. But by definition, it strives not to address issues of value. Now, it can't help it because scientists have to investigate some things and not others, so value enters into it. But by its own nature, science can't answer and tries not to answer questions of value. Now, it gets more complicated when you look at work like the primatology I discussed earlier, the origin of morality in animals and game playing, say, among rats. That starts to move into the domain of morality to some degree. But the problem with science is that it doesn't it strips out all subjective meaning. It's designed to do that. And that leaves everyone at a loss about what to do with the world of value. And I do believe that stories in particular address the world of value. That's their function. And the world of value is the world that we act in. They're guides to action.
Just again, notice the emphasis on the term value and what I said before of why I don't like using value when it comes to moral reasoning and moral discourse. I think, again, precisely because it's been sort of imported from other disciplines like economics and tends to make of the moral enterprise a very subjective project. This is why my position, and this is what Malister McIntyre, himself a great Catholic convert, argues, is that get rid of value from moral discourse. Go back to the good. And it just clarifies. Now, there's not all philosophers, not all theists and Christian philosophers agree with that. Some of them say, no, we should keep value in and we can give arguments for value. I'm currently not of that persuasion, but hopefully you could see how all this value talk just I think just invites a lot of the confusion and ambiguity that we've had to parse through in this conversation. So let's just do a few more minutes and we're going to hit pause on this and then we'll talk about doing a part 2.
Well, I come across it all the time in my work on the internet. So I have, dialogues with people that interact with my videos, and they'll say things like, well, the sciences give us access to the truth, period. The scientific method, that's how you get to the truth. And I'll say, so Hamlet tells you nothing true. Plato tells you nothing true. T.S. Eliot's poetry tells you nothing true. I mean, who would believe that except the most ideologically scientistic person? But see, my fear is a lot of young people are in the grip of that.
Yeah, let's just finish with a few words on scientism, right? So scientism is the idea if something can't like come out or be confirmed via the hypothetico-deductive method, then it's meaningless. It's we can't know it or something like that, right? It's a very restricted epistemology, and it's notoriously it's a self-refuting epistemology, right? Because the claim that we can only know things which come out of the hypothetico-deductive method is itself not something that we can know through the hypothetico-deductive method. So like right away, this epistemology just saws off the branch that it's sitting on, right? If it's true, it can't even meet its own standard, which means we don't even and shouldn't take it seriously anymore, right? So it's got this self-referential issue. It's got this self-defeat issue, but also, definitely like what is science? I've done a couple of episodes on this before with different scientists, and they don't all agree, right? This is a philosophical question of what science is. But but generally speaking, science, as commonly practiced, presupposes many other, not just forms of knowledge, but various assumptions that science itself cannot affirm or adjudicate. What are some of these? I mean, Bishop Barron, pointed to Hamlet and poetry, but I think those are, I think there's much stronger ones, right? Science presupposes what? Presupposes logic, right? Science doesn't give us logic. Science presupposes logic. Science presupposes what else? Mathematics. Doesn't give us that, right? Now people just want to say, oh, science and mathematics, or logic and mathematics, those are science, and you just expand science to include all these other things, then what you're saying is trivial, right? If science is just all these other things, then okay, fine. But that isn't typically what people mean. People mean something more restricted by science that of disciplines that presuppose logic, presuppose mathematics. Science also presupposes morality, right? How does it do it? Because scientists presuppose rightfully that you shouldn't falsify your results, that you shouldn't set up bogus experiments, right? And that you should, follow some type of objective criteria in how you interpret data and not just pull the things out that you want to be true because you have some agenda, right? These are all moral assumptions that go into science, that science does not give you, right? Science also just presupposes the reliability of our cognitive faculties, of our senses, the external world. Right. So this is what's very interesting when science like later comes around, like for the hardball physicalist scientism-y people who then want to go and say that consciousness is an illusion or there's no enduring selves. They're in a minority, but they're out there. It's like, man, like you needed all this stuff to even get to that ridiculous conclusion. So we have another self-defeat issue. So I hope that's adequate for everyone to understand why scientism is not is not science. First off, right? There's a difference between scientism, which is an epistemology, which itself has different versions. Like there's different versions of scientism. We're kind of lumping them all together. And some are certainly more nuanced than others, but they're all inadequate as far as I'm concerned. And science, right, which is a method of investigation. And so what we can say and what we should say is science, awesome, very useful, tells us a lot of important things. Can it tell us everything? No, it cannot, right? But can it tell us good and important things? Of course. But scientism as an epistemology is a horrendous mess. It is not justified. It has self-defeat issues, and science, of course, must presuppose other very many extremely important assumptions and modes of understanding and inquiry. So I just want to finish on that note of scientism there. But hey, guys, let me know if you enjoyed this. This was a new thing that we just tried, and we got and I do want to do a part 2 at least, because they actually start talking more about religious content and the New Testament, Jesus, and all that. And I think that would be really cool and important to discuss. So if you enjoyed this, if you would like a part 2, give me your comments. I'd love to hear what you thought of this conversation. I want this not to be a lecture, but a conversation between all of us. And certainly, if Jordan Peterson ever hears this, if he ever gets wind of this, it would be a great honor to have you on this podcast. I want to make it again clear: I am not bashing Jordan Peterson. I think he's a very intelligent, articulate, charitable, good man. He's in my prayers. I think he's doing a lot of good out there. I'm just using this as material for an exploratory and hopefully clarifying conversation. So if you enjoy it, please please subscribe, please share this. And let me know your thoughts in the comments. Leave some thoughts for the next one, and we'll try and do a part 2, as soon as we can, maybe even tomorrow morning. I'd like to get Jim on this, my buddy Jim, see if he'd be interested. So until then, guys, God bless all of you. We'll talk to you soon. Thanks for tuning in.